Welcome back. And hello to anyone who has joined us from afar. I'm delighted to welcome Angelika Kratzer, who's going to talk about David Lewis and formal semantics today.
Thank you for inviting me to this conference. This is not the usual talk I give. I'm a linguist, and the talk here felt more like a homework assignment where you're given a topic that you basically know nothing about and are to come up with something in a limited amount of time. And so that's what I did. My connection to David Lewis was I was introduced to his general semantics by Yehoshua Bar-Hillel in 1971. And that was my entry into my field, which is formal semantics within linguistic theory. So I will talk a little bit about what I perceive to be the role of David Lewis in the history of formal semantics. Okay, so my task was even more difficult by the fact that in the companion to David Lewis, there are already 3 excellent articles that basically exhausted the topic. So there's one by Ernie Lepore and Matthew Stone on the impact of convention on our investigation of the pragmatic semantics interface. There's a very extensive article by Barbara Partee, generally about the influence of David Lewis on semantics. And then finally, there is an article by Craigie Roberts on the impact of the scorekeeping in a language game article. So I had to find something that is a little bit different from what exists already. And so these will be my questions today. I'm interested in what the available tools were that philosophers who started to work on the semantics of natural languages, on the formal semantics of natural languages, what were the tools that were available to them already? So I tried to get a sense of what maybe the common ground was at the time at UCLA and the surroundings. The second topic I'm interested in was what was the relationship between David Lewis and the then emerging theories of generative grammar. So that's topic 2. And finally, I will have some reflections, some critical reflections on what David Lewis is for semantics today. Okay, so what kind of a toolkit was available when the young David Lewis started his work on formal semantics? So there was already, it seems, a very general sense that the semantics of natural languages were amenable to investigation with formal logical tools. And I give you a quote, and then I'll invite the semanticists among you, who I see sitting here, to guess who is being talked about. So here's the quote. Finally, the author gives a system of syntactical and semantical rules for a certain small segment of the English language as an illustration of his general thesis that there is no difference in principle between a formalized and a natural language. And so probably, if I can guess, your answer would be, this is about Richard Montague. This is not correct, the answer. So the author of the quote is Bar-Hillel, and he's talking about Alonzo Church. And he's talking about a paper by Alonzo Church, here the need for abstract entities in semantic analysis, that contains a small fragment of a grammar of English. So when you look at the article, this fragment looks hopelessly naive and simple. But when you look at it again, you have to realize that the fragment was written with his logic of sense and denotation in the background. And I'll give you an example in a few minutes of what the elements of that logic were. This is what Church himself, what he writes. Although all the foregoing account has been concerned with the case of a formalized language, I would go on to say that in my opinion, there's no difference in principle between this case and that of one of the natural languages. And so that was in 51. Very similar, this is one of the most quoted passages by Montague. There's, in my opinion, no important theoretical difference between natural languages and the artificial languages of logicians. Indeed, I consider it possible to comprehend the syntax and semantics of both kinds of languages within a single natural and mathematically precise theory. So very similar, and I assembled those quotes just to show that there was already, starting in the 40s and 50s, there was a very strong sense among logicians that natural languages could be treated with logical tools made available by Tarski. Okay, so here are a few examples from Church. So the tools, and again, for working semanticists, these are tools that we use every day. So we have a typed lambda calculus. We have generalized qualifiers. We analyze qualifier expressions as generalized qualifiers. We have types, basic types for individuals and truth values. We have functional types. We have currying or Schoenfinkelization. And so all of these tools you find in Church's logic of sense and denotation. And so here is an excerpt. That excerpt is actually from an exposition of Church's logic by Kevin Clement. I'll show you the original right away. I sort of thought that was a little bit more easily legible. And what I'd like to draw attention to is here the analysis of qualifier phrases that I've highlighted here. So a qualifier, a universally qualified statement here, is analyzed consisting of a constant, of a generalized qualifier type, and a property expressions that is formed via lambda abstraction. Church has a very, very complicated type system. And so here, just to simplify, so we have here type O is the type of truth values. So that would be type T in the more familiar Montague style notation. Alpha here is a variable over types. And so this is a very general type of qualifier expression where we can qualify over entities of various types. Now, just for simplification, imagine that alpha is in fact type I, the type of individuals, or type E in the Montague style system. And so here we have the typical type of a generalized qualifiers as a function that maps functions from individuals to truth values to truth values. So that is sort of a classical generalized qualifier analysis. Other interesting pieces here, in general, what could be done once this logic was in place is to give denotations to the usual logical connectives too. Okay. So this is one of the most praised tools of modern formal semantics today. So we have a typed lambda calculus. We have generalized qualifiers. So this is the source here. This is what it looks like in Church's paper. Just very similar. This is just exactly his original formulation. His types get read from right to left rather than the other way around. And, but that's basically what you find. And so here I contrasted this, what you find in general semantics and David Lewis's general semantics. Here you find a direct incarnation of this idea. You have a transitive verb in this case, loves. There are two argument positions of the individual type, so individual variables here. The arguments are saturated by individual variables. Then you have lambda abstraction, and so in this case you abstract over the object, direct object variable, and then you already have the kind of property denotation that a generalized qualifier phrase can range over. Then you do the same with the subject variable, and then you attach another generalized qualifier phrase on top. And so this can be seen as a direct implementation of using the tools that were already present in Church. And so what's illustrated here is the two readings of a sentence like, every boy loves some girl. Okay. So that was tool number 1, 2, or 3, maybe, if you like. And so the next very important tool was the intentional semantics. And the origin there, as far as can see, was in Carnap's meaning and necessity. Here, just a quote from this book, a proposal of how to construe possible worlds in terms of state descriptions. So what he's saying is, so we have a class of sentences in S1, in this language, which contains for every atomic sentence either this sentence or its negation, but not both, so familiar type of construing possible worlds, and not the Lewisian way of doing this, to be sure. And so this is called a state description. Thus, the state descriptions represent Leibniz's possible worlds, so Wittgenstein's possible states of affairs. And so that was Carnap's way of construing possible worlds. And once we do have these possible worlds in place, we can construe all kinds of intentions for all kinds of expressions. And so we can construe propositions, the values, the intentions of sentences as classes of state descriptions. We have individual concepts, can construe them as functions from state descriptions to individuals. We have properties construed as functions from individuals to propositions. And so this is in meaning and necessity if you look carefully enough. It's actually not so easy to find, so I had to consult David Lewis to sort of see that it's in paragraph 40 somewhere. So Carnap goes out of his way to not have to talk about what intentions are. So he talks about identity of intentions, but kind of avoids talk about, this is an intention. Okay, so here is a passage then by David Lewis from Convention. So truth condition specifies truth values for a sentence, but in all possible worlds, not just in whichever world happens to be actual. We can interpret a constituent of any category on the same principle by giving it an extension appropriate to its category in every possible world. The idea is Carnap's. It has recently been applied to the semantics of formalized languages with intentional operators in work by several philosophers in the tradition of Tarski and Carnap. So Church was one of those. Okay, so Lewis was directly inspired here by what Carnap did. The last tool, I believe, are categorical grammars that were introduced by Artukiewicz and popularized by Bar-Hillel. So here is what David Lewis does in general semantics. So he assumes a generative grammar of a very general kind. The particular instantiation that he presents looks like this. So this is a typical categorical grammar where the syntactic rules are fully specified by the categories assigned two syntactic categories. So we have here, the type of a determiner. We have the type of a verb like believe. So believe is something that takes a sentence as its first argument to then produce something that takes a noun, in this case the subject, to produce a sentence. Porky, a popular name in general semantics, is a noun. Pig is a common noun. Something is analyzed as a generalized qualifier. It takes a property. A property is something that takes a noun to produce a sentence, and the result is a sentence again, and so on. And so the great advantage of using a categorical grammar here as a base is that once you have the categories specified, you not only have specified the complete syntax of this fragment, you also can dispense with particular semantic composition rules, because the composition rules directly follow here the syntactic categories, which are identical to the semantic types. Okay, so that is the great advantage of using categorical grammar here. If the notations of linguistic expressions are functions that directly correspond to syntactic categories in a categorical grammar, all semantic composition amounts to functional application. So you have these functional syntactic categories that determine the syntax that directly correspond to functional denotations, and composition, semantic composition, all amounts to functional application. So that is the story. Something that is very important in David Lewis's work is ultimately he does not want to commit to a particular syntactic framework. And so we'll come back to that again, so that I'll try to find the roots of that already in his book, Convention. So here what he says, I claim that whatever familiar sort of base component you may favor on syntactic grounds. So this was a time in linguistics where there were wars between different types of frameworks. And he sort of very clearly sort of sees that what you have to do if you want to give the semantics of a language, you can abstract away from many details that particular syntactic frameworks may have posited. And that's exactly what he does here too. He does give a particular categorical grammar. He does assume that there may be a transformational component, but ultimately what he says does not commit him to any particular form of a generative grammar. So here, this is what he writes, also in general semantics here. He says, here, I mean, in this particular fragment, he does assume that there is a transformational component that ultimately gives us the surface strings that we are looking for, but this is not essential. So a transformation-free categorical grammar is a special case of a categorially based transformational grammar. It has a transformational component with no transformation, so global constraints, so that the derivations therein are all and only those sequences consisting of a single phrase marker. So, I mean, he sort of emphasizes that he did give a particular example that seems to require a transformational component, but this is not essential. So my assessment here is that by the time David Lewis began working on natural language semantics, there was already a very strong sense that natural languages could be given a Tarski-style semantic. So that's something he inherited, something I assume was part of the common ground at the time. And also, and that was a little bit of a surprise to me, that all the essential tools that he used in spelling out his semantics and that we use as semanticists today, they also were already in place. I think pretty much all of them. And so this then formed the starting point for work by many semanticists in the 70s, like Lewis, Montague, Parsons, and Creswell. Okay, moving on to my next topic. So I'd like to look into a little bit more detail into David Lewis's vision for a theory of grammar. And I went back here to Convention, where there are just a few pages dedicated to this topic. But going back after so many years to this book, just particularly looking at those few pages, again, it was a big surprise for me, how modern this conception of grammar looks. Okay, so we'll look at the syntax. One very important property of David Lewis's work in semantics is that he had a lot of appreciation for the work contemporary generative syntacticians did at the time. So he knew exactly, for example, what the job of syntax was. And so here is what he writes: a good deal of recent effort in linguistic theory has been devoted to finding a suitable normal form for grammars. And when he talks about normal forms, I mean, this is what today maybe we would call a logical form. And so that's some syntactic representation that forms the input for semantic interpretation. And so here he refers to Chomsky, but again, he is non-committal in the end, does not commit himself to any particular framework. And so he very clearly sees that there is a division of labor between what a syntax does in generating well-formed sentences of a language in an insightful way, and what kind of input a semantic interpretation component needs. And so here he says, it will do us no harm to have many extra entities counting as possible languages, as well as the ones we really want. But we must bear in mind that languages without grammars, or without grammars of whatever turns out to be the appropriate normal form, logical form, are called possible languages only because we have been too lazy to rule them out. And so it's just, well, okay, I'm not concerned with those. I'm not a syntactician. I'm not trained as a syntactician. I'm not doing syntax. I let syntacticians do what their job is, namely see, that the morphology, the agreement, whatever, that this turns out right. So he was interested in whatever are the bare bones that we need for an insightful semantic component. So here, but again, he does give us a concrete example of what a possible grammar might look like, what the possible components of a grammar may be. So let me nevertheless try to say how one sort of grammar for a possible language L might work. I distinguish three parts of the grammar called the lexicon, the generative component, and the representing component. Again, in convention. So we have a lexicon, like that gives you the smallest elementary constituents indicating the category. So they're smallest elements, the atoms plus a category. Then we have a generative component, and that's particularly interesting in convention, as we'll see in a minute. So this would be a finite set of combining operations, and these operations actually operate over phrase structure trees here. They operate over constituents of given categories. And then we have what he calls a representing component. So these operations, they give us something like possibly some expressions in some kind of normal form that would lend themselves to semantic interpretations. Then he has the representing component that maybe today we would call a spell-out component. So this is a component then that transforms the normal form into what we see or hear in English, say, if English is our language. So the representing component here spells out the output of the generative component and may or may not move things or delete things, add material. So certain jobs that at the time were assumed to be done by transformations were done by the representing component in this model. So this is what it looks like. And the way to parse this would be what this spells out is the operations that take as their input phrase structure trees and build new phrase structure trees from them. For the linguists among them, we could call this, in modern terminology, this is a merge operation that operates over phrase structure trees and outputs phrase structure trees. So these bold lines, I mean, these are the combining operations. The others, the trees, I mean, they take trees as input and output other trees. Then we have a representing component, and so we have even like a phonetic transcription at the end. And there's a nice anecdote that Barbara Partee tells in one of her articles, is that he actually checked with her whether the phonetic representation was right, and it was flawless. I mean, that's what she reports. Okay, so what I'd like to emphasize here is that for Lewis, he also very clearly saw that any insightful syntax for a natural language has to include a representation of constituent structure, of phrase structure. So we can't just merely manipulate strings and stitch them together. We have to recognize that natural language expressions are structured into they have a constituent structure. Okay. So he presupposes that a representation of constituent structure is crucial for any grammar for a natural language. And that really is in stark contrast with what Montague did, for example. And I just like to give you an illustration of the importance of constituent structure. And the illustration comes from various appearances, let's call them, by Chomsky. So this is a movie, a sort of relatively recent movie made with Chomsky. And it has a title, Is the Man Who is Tall Happy? And you may be wondering why this title. And so here is the story behind it. Imagine you're a child just learning how yes/no questions are formed in English. And so you have something like the man is happy, and in order to produce a yes/no question from that, what you do is you take the first or the leftmost finite verb and front it, put it in front of the sentence. That produces, is the man happy, from the man is happy. Okay, now the point of the movie title is take a sentence like the man who is tall is happy and apply the simple rule that you have just deduced. What you get, so you take the leftmost finite verb, move it to the front of the sentence, you get something completely ungrammatical. What you get in the end is the man who tall is happy, and that is gibberish. So, the point is that in English, the syntactic rule that the child has to pick up is not that the first finite verb or the left finite verb has to be fronted to form a question. The rule is that the highest finite verb has to be fronted to give you a question. And in order to be able to talk about the highest finite verb, of course, you have to have some phrase structure. You have to have some constituent structure. So that is the point that Chomsky is making in this movie. It's also the point he made in a very famous encounter with Jean Piaget, where again the topic was language acquisition. What does a child have to pick up from the data to learn her language? And so he made the same point Piaget did not get it. So you can sort of read the debate is documented here, translated into various languages, including Brazilian Portuguese. You can sort of read Chomsky's desperate attempts to show to Piaget that structure dependence is important. So David Lewis saw this as a very young student with some familiarity in generative syntax. So he saw immediately that constituent structure, if you do syntax at all, constituent structure is important. Interestingly, for Montague, if you look at, this is sort of an excerpt from the proper treatment of qualification in English. In his original work here, there is no representation of constituent structure. So basically, his syntactic rules manipulate strings and not constituents, so which I think is a basic flaw in the kind of syntax he proposed. Clearly seen by Partee in her very earliest paper on Montague, where she proposed a crucial addition to Montague's syntax, namely then to assign to each generated expression also a representation of phrase structure. So that's one of her crucial addition that she made. And so these are my comments on the vision the very young David Lewis had on what a syntax for natural language should look like, generalizing in a very interesting way, abstracting away from inessential properties, but then zooming in on some very essential properties here. So here just a few remarks on his semantics. So this is now, before that I already talked a little bit about general semantics, where he adopts a categorical grammar as a base, because with the great advantage that no particular semantic composition rules would be needed. So this is not so in his convention, in the few pages of convention. So here he has, as we already saw, he has a finite stock of syntactic operations that combine phrase structure trees. And he assumes a rule-by-rule semantic component where for each syntactic operation, we have a corresponding semantic operation here. So this is what he says: as the combining operations build up infinitely many larger and larger constituents, starting with the lexical elements, the corresponding projection operations work in parallel to derive interpretations for those constituents, starting with interpretations of the lexical items. So this is a typical format for a rule-by-rule interpretation. He credits the general method to Gerald Katz, who was working within a Chomskyan framework. So what he says, I have subscribed to Katz's account of the way in which a grammar derives interpretations for a sentence by starting with the interpretations for lexical elements, using projection operations to derive interpretations for larger and larger constituents, and finally handing over interpretations from sentential constituents to the sentences representing them. But now there comes a disagreement with Katz. So far we have something that he adopted from Gerald Katz. But then he says, but I have not endorsed Katz's account of the nature of these interpretations. That is a separate question. Katz takes them to be expressions built out of symbols called semantic markers, which represent conceptual elements in the structure of a sentence. I find this account unsatisfactory, since it leads to a semantic theory that leaves out such central notions as truth and reference. So he here adopts the general method of Katz, of projection rules matching the syntactic operations, but then distances themselves and adopts a Carnapian view of what intentions are, but of course with his particular view of what a possible world is. Also, in convention, he sort of adds indexicality as one of the indices with respect to which interpretations are construed, and he credits both Montague and Dana Scott for this. So Montague and Scott propose a unified treatment of intension and indexicality in which extensions are assigned relative to points of reference, combinations of a possible world, and several relevant features of context, a time, place, speaker, audience, etc. So this is further elaborated than in general semantics and taken back in part in his index, context, and content. Okay, so my general assessment is that the very young David Lewis proposed a blueprint for a model of grammar that reconciled the essence of a generative approach to syntax, which he very clearly understood, with the essence of a compositional, truth-conditional semantics. And all that was done just in a few pages of a book that was on a very, very different topic. So here, now a few very critical reflections on the place of David Lewis in contemporary semantics. And so this is more, these are more reflections on the sociology of the field than on anything else. So there is the story of founding fathers. So disciplines like nations and cities are said to have founding fathers and founding stories. And so here's just an example of Wikipedia has long lists of this kind where you have a subdiscipline and then some person is the obvious father usually. So here they politely have considered father or mother, but of course you don't find a single mother there. So it's now in sort of thinking about the ascription of the title or the conferring of the title of a founding father, I found it very enlightening to read an article by Bernadette Bonsaud-Vincent on Lavoisier in the history of chemistry. And so what she said, a new era had begun, but how does one progress from the notion of revolution to that of foundation, or from historic talk to mythical narrative? And so the question that I want to reflect on is, what is the story of a founding father? Who is our founding father? Do we want to even talk about anything like a founding father for formal semantics? So formal semantics is said to have a founding father too. If you read the literature in semantics, you will find reference to founding father, but the title has not been conferred on David Lewis. And so here sort of a typical example of a founding story by my friend, Edith Zimmerman. So we have, like, in the afternoon of October 15th, 1968, Richard Montague gave a talk that would later be published as the first of his 3 classic papers on natural language semantics, though the broad linguistic community did not become aware of it until its popularization in Partee in 1975. The foundations of modern compositional semantics had been laid with the appearance of English as a formal language by Montague. And so, I mean, that is sort of a typical founding story. There is one talk by one particular person, and that founded the discipline. Similar, even a little stronger, is from a website by Ivano Caponigo, a brilliant philosopher and logician who, among other achievements, fathered formal semantics just a few years before he was murdered. And one of the aspects learned by reflecting on the history of chemistry was that very often the people who are subsequently made into founding fathers, they thought so themselves. And I think this is also the case with Montague. So here's a passage from him. Like, it is clear, however, that no adequate and comprehensive semantical theory has yet been constructed, and arguable that no comprehensive and semantically significant syntactical theory yet exists. I mean, that was like when generative grammar syntax was really at its peak. Or even a reasonable semantics for a reasonably comprehensive fragment of any natural language, with a single exception of the treatment in Montague, that's English as a formal language, of a fragment of English. And so that's what he writes about himself. He's well known for his remarks on transformational syntax. So in particular, I believe that transformational grammarians should be expected to produce a rigorous definition, complete in all details, of the set of declarative sentences of some reasonably rich fragment of English, at least as rich as the fragments treated below, this is universal grammar, or in Montague 4, again, English as a formal language, before their work can be seriously evaluated or even looked at, I suppose. As Partee reports in her companion article, and this was confirmed by Anthony, is that David Lewis was not happy with this outspoken hostility against transformational grammar by Montague. And so this is an excerpt from a letter he wrote to Partee. Says, where will I find a precise definition of a transformational grammar? Montague's been reading Aspects and Jacobs and Rosenbaum and claims he still hasn't the foggiest idea what a transformation is. I'd like to try to shut him up, though it's probably not a worthwhile thing for me to try to do. Having read a little transformational grammar, he plans to lambaste it more than ever. So that's what he wrote. Also, after Montague's death, there is a letter that is also quoted in Partee's chapter, where Lewis sort of says, like, Montague's efforts to isolate his approach from the thought of others about the same problems. And so he seems to have been aware that maybe his own work also was not sufficiently taken into consideration by his colleague Montague. So this was at a time when then in linguistics, there was a proliferation of new models. So new models of grammar were put forward in the 70s and later, and most of them targeted syntax, or the way we think about syntax. So there are a lot of differences about the way we think about syntax, and most of them also were very explicitly anti-Chomskyan, so targeted transformational grammar. And so Montague's hostility, I think, fit perfectly into this picture. And so there's all kinds of different theories that came into existence and in part exist even today. And so the question is, how does Lewis fit into this? And so what I would say is, like, from his earliest work in formal semantics, David Lewis linked a truth conditional semantics to syntax in a way that's not only easily accessible to newcomers in semantics, but is also neutral with respect to the various syntactic models that have been proposed. And so he made a point of this. So it's a very reconciling force in linguistics. And so this is my final word here with the poster for the conference. And so I think that, his unifying vision for semantics, his neutrality with respect to the syntactic base required, is sure to have helped formal semantics to become the unifying discipline that it is today. And just to close with an anecdote, some years ago, I was invited to the Amsterdam Colloquium, which is one of the major semantics conferences today, I was invited together with Polly Jacobson. And Polly Jacobson and I, we have very different views on syntax. I mean, really very opposing views on syntax. And we were each sent the same set of abstracts to review for that colloquium, semantics colloquium. We came up with exactly the same scores. And so that sort of shows that the spirit that came out of David Lewis's work is really, is maybe to the present day, a unifying force in semantics. Okay, so that's the end.